In the heart of London, where the fog clung to the streets like a shroud and the gas lamps flickered dimly, there stood an old, decrepit hospital known as Street Bartholomew's. It was a place where the sick and the dying came to spend their final days, and where the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and despair. But one cold winter's night, the hospital became the scene of a mystery that would baffle even the most seasoned detectives. It all began with the arrival of a man named Mr. Alistair Graves. He was a wealthy businessman, known for his sharp mind and ruthless dealings. But now he was a shadow of his former self, his face pale and drawn, his body racked with pain. He had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and the doctors had given him only a few weeks to live. Determined to spend his final days in comfort, he had checked into Street Bartholomew's, where he was given a private room on the top floor. The hospital staff were used to dealing with death, but there was something about Mr. Graves that made them uneasy. He was a man who had always been in control, and even now, as he lay dying, he seemed to be plotting something. He had brought with him a large suitcase, which he kept locked at all times, and he had instructed the nurses not to disturb him unless absolutely necessary. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. Mr. Graves spent most of his time in his room, reading books and writing in a small notebook. But on the fourth night, something strange happened. The night nurse, a young woman named Mary, was making her rounds when she heard a loud crash coming from Mr. Graves' room. She rushed to the door and knocked, but there was no answer. Worried, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was in chaos. The furniture had been overturned, and the suitcase was lying open on the floor, its contents spilled out. But the most shocking thing was that Mr. Graves was gone. The window was wide open, and the curtains were fluttering in the cold night air. Mary ran to the window and looked out, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. A hospital staff searched the building from top to bottom, but there was no trace of Mr. Graves. The police were called in, but they too were baffled. How could a dying man, weak and frail, have disappeared without a trace? And what had been in the suitcase that was so important? The mystery deepened when the police examined the contents of the suitcase. Inside, they found a collection of old photographs, letters, and a small leather-bound diary. The diary contained detailed notes on various business deals, some of which were highly illegal. It seemed that Mr. Graves had been involved in some shady dealings, and that he had been keeping a record of everything. But the most intriguing item in the suitcase was a small, intricately carved wooden box. Inside the box was a single, folded piece of paper. On it was written a single word: revenge. The police were stumped. Who was Mr. Graves planning to take revenge on? And why had he disappeared? The case remained unsolved, and over time, it faded from the public's memory. But for those who had been there that night, the mystery of the terminal case would never be forgotten. Years later, a young detective named Arthur Collins came across the case while going through some old files. Intrigued, he decided to investigate. He tracked down the former staff of Street Bartholomew's and interviewed them, piecing together the events of that fateful night. He also managed to locate some of Mr. Graves' former business associates, who revealed that he had been involved in a bitter feud with a rival businessman named Victor Blackwood. Blackwood had been found dead a few weeks after Mr. Graves' disappearance, his body discovered in a deserted alley. The police had ruled it a suicide, but Collins wasn't so sure. He began to suspect that Mr. Graves had faked his own death in order to exact his revenge on Blackwood. But there was one final twist in the tale. As Collins delved deeper into the case, he discovered that Mr. Graves had not been acting alone. He had been aided by a mysterious woman who had visited him in the hospital just days before his disappearance. The woman had never been identified, and her role in the events remained a mystery. In the end, Collins was forced to conclude that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. The terminal case remained open, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the human heart. And as for Mr. Alistair Graves, he was never seen or heard from again. Some say he died that night, while others believe he is still out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. But one thing is certain. The truth behind the terminal case will remain a mystery, buried in the shadows of Street Bartholomew's Hospital.